Dark is an editor, a programming language, and an infrastructure compiler in one. And our goal is making it super, super simple to build backends in the cloud. You see all these companies where the first thing they do is they set up their Kubernetes-based microservice before they've written a single line of code. And it's like, what are you doing? The needs of an early customer, like how reliable or polished you need to be for that first customer, is often 2 orders of magnitude lower than people expect. There's this idea of hackathon is a thing where you go and you build this app in a weekend. And we're actually getting to the stage now where people aren't writing anything in hackathons because it's just too much work to build an application.
Welcome to High Leverage, a series of conversations about scaling modern software teams through better tooling and processes. I'm your host, Joe Ruscio, a general partner here at Heavybit. High Leverage is brought to you by Heavybit, a program that helps companies building cloud infrastructure, developer tools, and APIs take their products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you'd like to suggest a guest or topic for this show, let us know on Twitter @Heavybit.
All right, everybody, welcome back. We're really excited to be joined by our guest today, Paul Biggar, who is a Heavybit alumnus, a founder of a Heavybit company, one we're super proud of, Circle CI. If you hopefully are doing testing, then they're probably at the top of your list for continuous integration. Is also host of a popular podcast on the Heavybit network, more popular than this one, in fact, although I'm gunning for it. To Be Continuous, which is great. Paul and Edith from Launch Darkly have a great podcast. And last but not least, has a new thing going on. So is the CTO and co-founder of Dark, which is super descriptive. So we'll get into that more, but is at darkling.com, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, the pleasure is all ours. So we have a couple things we want to talk about today. This podcast is about helping, modern software teams get better, get more productive, get more done with fewer people, have fewer failures, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things, especially now that you've built multiple companies, especially companies with actually really challenging infrastructure things, right? A continuous integration play is actually in the details.
We built a platform as a service essentially for CI. Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds run tests, right? But this is at scale a big thing, and so what kind of learnings going from quote unquote garage to seed stage to A to bigger. One of the things I've always found fascinating, I'd love to get your take, is having gone through that myself, is that the things that work really, really well at one stage and the best thing for one of those stages break just in horrific ways at the next one. Yeah. And you kind of have to redo it, right?
Right. There's the standard thing of each inflection point, you're going to need a different set of tooling to last you for the next 10x scaling. But I think people often don't scale that down and think about, when I have 0 customers or 1 customer or the first 10 customers, can I do something that's even cheaper than you often do?
Yeah, it's sort of the inverse is true as well.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So you see all these companies where the first thing they do is they set up their Kubernetes-based microservice before they've written a single line of code. And it's like, what are you doing?
Yeah, well, it's not required to get things going.
Right. So one of the things that we do with Dark is we look at how people write new pieces of software. And a lot of people look to hackathons, and there's this idea of a hackathon is a thing where you go and you write code, you build this app in a weekend. And we're actually getting to the stage now where people aren't writing anything in hackathons because it's just too much work to build an application.
Right. Particularly the Rails community, right? If it's people who are there who are long term, bemoan what used to be when the beauty there is hey, you can get an app up and running in 5 minutes. Now it's there's 30 JavaScript frameworks you have to pick from, and you got to get NPM installed, and you got to get this other thing.
None of them work together, and you have to get your Webpack thing set up, and you have to get it continuously deployed. And once you've done all of that, then you can finally write software.
Start writing some code, right? Yeah.
And there's so many people I talk to have a side project that they were so excited about, and then after 16 hours of doing this infra framework, they just they didn't care anymore. They had no passion left for whatever it was they were building.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I think you hit on this at the very beginning, is a lot of these things which are now being considered boilerplate, right?
Yeah.
Were designed originally. So let's just pick on Kubernetes a bit, which, obviously, we love it, great technology, but was designed by Google to help them manage planet scale clusters. Right. And, if you can run your entire infrastructure on 3 servers, maybe it's not solving the same set of problems.
Yeah, or one or less than
Right,
one.
right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think one of the
dating myself with the 3 servers here. It used to be 3.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure that almost anyone starting to build a service today wouldn't even know how to get started with like acquiring 3 servers.
Right.
And like, putting them in a colo and like buying the parts off the internet and then like putting them together and putting them on a rack somewhere and then like doing some sort of installing an OS and
Yeah, or even, I mean, I was even thinking, even 3 instances because you want to be in 3 availability zones, right? But
Right.
now,
so quaint.
yeah, right. I mean, that would be half of all availability zones pretty
Right.
much at the time. You hear more and more, and I think reaction to this, I hear more and more now on serverless first,
Right,
right,
okay,
which is
yeah.
kind of this emerging kind of doctrine about let's try to make it serverless first,
Yeah.
and then if we can't make it work there, then we'll drop back to a 24/7 running process that we have more kind of control and we can right size resources for. What's your just the notion on serverless in general? Besides that, yes, it does in fact run on servers. We don't need to go there.
Right. I mean, I think that serverless as a concept and looking at broader than like Lambda or cloud functions or whatever, I think is a wonderful idea. It's disappointing though. Like the entire space around serverless is starting to have the Kubernetesification problem again. It's like it started with, well, we just want to run a function in the cloud.
Yeah, just effectively like a cron job type function,
right?
A batch job.
An actual function in the programming language sense. It's maybe it has to be JavaScript or whatever, but there's an input, there's an output, it's done, and it's a lovely concept. And there's just so much more that you need to do to actually run a thing. You need to monitor it, you need to scale it, and Lambda does some scaling, but like it has a cold start problem and all this other thing. And so now I'm sure you saw it reInvent. AWS brought out Lambda Layers. I think it's called. I didn't even look at what it was called. I'm done with the whole thing. It's it's already too much. When we went to put some stuff in Lambda as a way of trying it out, it took like 8 hours. Like it's not at all the simplicity that you are hoping for. It's huge complexity around a simple concept.
Well, it's the kind of thing where I feel like they often just focus on the initial abstraction, which to your point was a single function, whether it's like a webhook or a cron job kind of thing. But it's not even just that it's a pure function with like one input and some processing and something that comes back, but it exists in isolation, just from like literally conceptually, what does it do? What does this one thing? Now, I think as people are starting to try and build more complicated applications out of it, what I find is a fascinating challenge, especially with this infrastructure that's really, or products that aren't really built for that at all, is, okay, it's bad enough when we've gone all in our Kubernetes microservices and we've crossed Dunbar's number of microservices and nobody in the org actually knows what all of them are or what they do.
Right.
Saying we're going to take those microservices, each of which do like, I don't know, 5 or 6 related things, probably more in practice, and then break them into individual functions. Well, now I have like tens of thousands of things that are related somehow and have like flows that go through them.
Right. And you've got a management problem, a version control problem, a continuous delivery problem, a testing problem. Like it's just, I think that the thing that Lambda and serverless is trying to do is good. Not a huge fan of how it ended up.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're definitely clearly still, if you subscribe to like the Gartner hype cycle model, we're still clearly rocketing up. We haven't hit the trough of disillusionment yet. Right. Some of the things you're hinting at.
Yeah, I mean, I think people need to keep looking at this less idea. So the amount of accidental complexity that is in how we build software today is crazy. And so
what are some examples of that?
The very obvious one is all the infrastructure stuff. You have to learn Kubernetes and Docker, and you have to learn all that stuff. At the same time, you have to build your continuous delivery pipeline and your continuous integration and testing. You have all this tooling challenge, and you see the amount of companies that come through. Heavybit and all the other companies in the space, they're all providing one piece of the pie. And so we have 50 things that you need to consider before you even start writing any software at all.
Yeah, I've personally found the explosion of complexity in the development environment to be a fascinating problem that, I mean, certainly most people aren't even talking about unless it's commiseration, and certainly aren't solving yet. Whereas historically back, again, just using an example, if you fired up a Rails app, you had one application, one database, and yeah, you could load up your local browser. And that dev environment actually looked reasonably close to production.
Yep.
Now, if you're using like a microservices or even more granular environment, the number of moving pieces you need on your laptop to effectively replicate production is like not tractable, right?
It's not that these things started from a bad place. It's like, there's extremely valid reasons for microservices and places that monoliths break down, especially with like scaling and deployment velocity. You don't necessarily want them all to be on the same thing. Some things need to be extremely high reliability. Some things need to be redeployed at dozens of times a day. So you do want to break those apart. You want to have some sort of boundary. But the end result, it hasn't worked out particularly well. And I think what you're saying about the trough of disillusionment is right. We're starting to see that steep decline.
Well, it's something where we've made giant strides towards fixing problems in scaling production environments and how quickly we can, like the velocity, we can make changes at scale in large scale applications. Yeah. But the trade-off, because there's no free lunch, no silver bullets, is we dramatically increase the complexity of the development environment. Right.
I mean, this is where I should tell you about my new company, Darkline, and how it solves all these problems. But before we do, I want to get to that later. Your original question was, someone is starting something today, they're doing something small. I talk to a lot of those companies, and the advice I give them is see if you can build it without software. Even if you're an engineer, see if you can throw it together with Zapier and Google Sheets, or Airtable, or product management techniques like Wizard of Oz. Have someone do it by email or by a form, and there's an actual human behind it.
A human,
see if you can get validation before you start to build the actual product, because if you build the product first, you're going to spend 6 months doing that, and once you've spent that 6 months doing that, you're going to find that it's wrong in some way that you don't know yet. Whereas if you spent a week doing that in a completely slipshod, haphazard way, you would only have spent a week to learn the lessons and to move in the direction of what you actually needed to build.
Yeah, and it's great advice. I mean, it harkens back to some of the lean startup stuff that was
absolutely
all the rage. So say you do that, right? You've got and especially it is kind of interesting, like tools like Airtable, there are like dramatically improved tools that you can plug together and actually get, they won't scale. And you said they'll have to be humans polishing edges and handling things, but you can actually get working systems with, just plugging these together.
Right. And the needs of an early customer, like how reliable or polished you need to be for that first customer, is often like 2 orders of magnitude lower than people expect.
Right. And because often what you'll be doing is you'll be paying that kind of hidden cost with humans, right? Whether it's your quote, not sales engineers, because you won't have any of them officially, but you as the founder acting with your sales engineer, your customer success hat on, you'll be talking directly to those people, finding out what's wrong and literally like pulling them through those problems and manually fixing things on the back.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you decide when you get to the next stage? Like, what's the kind of trigger that says, oh, okay, I'm onto something here. I should go to the next stage. What's that next stage look like? How do you formalize those things?
I mean, personally, at that stage, 1 to 2 people or maybe 1 to 5 people, the process that I favor is like fix whatever's on fire. And if the thing that is on fire is actually just this whole thing is not working, we need a rewrite, and it's very likely that you're going to hit that if you literally build it with
if you committed to if you're really committed to minimal.
Right. But what you'll probably do is the thing that works least, will be rewritten on something that's a little more reliable. Maybe you'll put it on serverless or something like that. Or maybe like, honestly, a Rails app is probably the right thing, or a monolith at least is the right thing as you start to rebuild. And then you can turn that relatively quickly into something that scales for your first 100,000 customers. If you're B2B SaaS or something, different constraints. If you're building like a high scale mobile app or something like that, or a consumer app of some kind, but certainly B2B, you can get away with that.
Especially like a traditional B2B app, it's effectively like a database with some business logic in front of it.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I always think those are. It's kind of fascinating the amount of raw compute you can get today in very small packages.
Right.
It's I don't want to say never easy to scale things, but certainly a lot less challenging than it used to be.
And I think one of the reasons that we end up with a lot of this complexity is because so much of the business value is now provided on the front end.
Yeah, which is kind of. I mean, do you think that's part of why the rise of Jamstack, right? JavaScript APIs and markup, where we're moving towards this notion in a lot of places of fully formed front-end applications served down statically through CDNs that then connect back to GraphQL APIs.
Right, exactly, yeah.
With headless backend services. Do you think that's part of the reason that that's happened? That because the value is really focusing or pooling in the front end now?
Yeah, I think that we solved a lot of what you can do on the back end and made it, at least a little bit easier conceptually. And so now the great challenge is to architect these really well-performing, I just want to say good front-end apps.
Yeah. So your kind of newest project gig, Dark, is
Dark.
sort of an extreme example of this, right?
Yes. So Dark is an editor, a programming language, and an infrastructure compiler in one. And our goal is removing all of the stuff that we've been talking about, making it super, super simple to build backends in the cloud.
Yeah, and so effectively, I mean, you've got your own language, right? Like
it's our own language.
It's a language that's natively defined with a notion of production infrastructure inside the language itself, right?
Yeah.
And things
There's a bunch of different ways that we describe it, but one of them is a language designed for continuous delivery.
Right.
So it's like built into the language is the concept of deployment of how does this get in the cloud? How does it scale? It's holistic, basically.
Right. And it's, including things so far as like data, say databases, but data at rest, right? And
yes.
Persistent data storage.
Right. It's right in the language.
It's kind of blurring all those lines, those kind of hard lines that a novice user, right, would have to, okay, well, I know how to write a script that I can run the command line.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now I have to figure out how to run a database.
Right, and now I need to know how to write SQL, and now I need to know how to be able to do monitoring on my database. And that's, we're only in the database side of it. Like, add that for the compute side of it, for the queues side of it. If you want to have a service, do you need to be an expert in running Kafka? If you want to do analytics, do you need to be an expert in running Cassandra?
Right. And you have these constructs, so like message queues and other abstractions in the platform and language itself, which, I think is really interesting, especially the first time we talked about it. Fundamentally, one outcome is to dramatically increase potentially the number of people who can write production code.
Yes. So the way that we target it is by trying to remove all the bullshit that you have to do to write code. And I'm aiming it at you and me and coders, but there's so many people who are on the periphery of coding who
right
are
on the precipice, right? Like they're almost there.
They're learning to code, or they are in a coding adjacent job like a designer or a PM or something like that. And where if we made it easier by removing all the bullshit, like the stuff that we were talking about with serverless earlier and with Lambda, if we just removed a lot of that complexity, they would be able to do it.
Right.
So it's not our first port of call, but it's definitely something that we're thinking about.
It's an interesting side effect. We definitely subscribe here, and I firmly believe that as much as is being done, and not enough, but as much as is being done to expand the access to people who can become developers if they're interested, that the appetite or the need for them, I think, will be almost impossible to fill as software just wends its way through every single part of every industry.
Absolutely.
And it's software is the kind of thing, as you can always make it more complex, right? So even if everybody can hire them. And so I think things that could dramatically increase the number of developers in the world stand to kind of dramatically increase what gets done.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
and if you look at the number of people who could be developers or who could build software, and you think, are they going to go through the process of learning Kubernetes or of learning serverless or of writing Docker files or any of those sort of things, when all they really want to do is take data from one API, do some compute on it, and write data to another API.
Right. And I think what's always an interesting indicator in these kind of things, I mean, there's a few other, I know doing different things, but semi-related. So there's Glitch is, I think, really popular kind of in the same area. There's a Replit.
Yeah.
And there may be others.
There's a ton. There's so many out there.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's always a good sign, right? It's a good sign. I think the fact that there is a signal that there's something happening here, that there's multiple of these companies coming together. What do you think was the space, right? What do we call this kind of solution? It's certainly serverless.
Yeah, it's a thing that doesn't have a name yet. The only name I've heard anyone apply to it, I showed Jess Rosselli what we were doing, and she called it deployless.
Deployless.
Yeah, it's. I'm not sure if we love it yet, but it certainly applies
I can see
to
it's
what
in the
we're
running.
doing. And it also applies to Glitch and Replit and.
Right. Again, the notion that you're kind of always working on production code. I mean, there's like gates and versioning and everything, but there's not this distinct notion of like, okay, my code is finished in dev and the pull requests are reviewed, and now we're going to deploy.
Right.
Which,
the place that we started with Dark is we made a list of all the accidental complexity that we want to remove, and one broad category was deployment. If you want deployment to be really fast, you want to be able to get stuff out to your customers really fast. Well, the fastest that you can do it is 0, like just completely removed. And so it becomes, what does it look like to build software if there is 0-second deploy?
Off the top of your head, like what are the heavy hitters on that list of accidental complexity?
The heavy hitters are infrastructure, deploys using APIs, and then just the software development process itself, everything from like syntax errors to GitHub.
Got it. So things like actual code versioning and pull requests are native as well.
Yeah. And so all of those things for Dark are defined around this idea of deployless or like continuous delivery. So as an example, every database table, every function, and every type is versioned. So you never go through the process of, I make a change over here and it just like takes out something over there. So it's designed for, start to finish around this idea of you're going to make changes and then you're going to like carefully put them out route by route or group by group, use feature flags, etc.
Yeah, it's amazing that, especially I guess building on now, going on 20 years of kind of best practices of what it means to deploy a web-based application, whether that's access from a mobile or a browser or whatever. And, making those things native, I think, potentially very interesting, right? I mean, even like you said, even just feature flagging, right? Like wiring that up. I mean, certainly, companies like Edith and Launch Darkly have made this dramatically easier than when we had to literally get Zookeeper and a bunch of other things and paste it together. So are you seeing, I know it's super early, are you seeing like production applications? That's always a question with new technologies. Like, this is great for side projects, but like people run their business on it.
So at the moment, we have 2 people running their business on it.
Excellent.
We're still nowhere near launch. There's so much to do still, but we needed to validate our early hypotheses of can people write software this way? And the results that you get from Dark, it's not even the things that we've taken away that they care the most about. It's now that we have all this stuff in the same place, the new things that we can do, like the introspection that we allow you to have into your application, those are the sort of things that I think are going to redefine how software development ends up working.
Yeah, and just from a implementation perspective, which a lot we give very relatively technical audience, I think is always interesting. So first of all, I guess you're learning a lot about programming language theory and.
Well, so I kind of have a PhD in that.
Oh, not well. I'm still learning some, but
yeah. Oh no, I'm learning a lot.
So you're actually going back to your roots.
Yeah. I mean, when I started Circle, it was very much like, what's the closest SaaS company that I could make that's like, roughly compilers as a service.
And it was continuous
integration.
I could see that.
Yeah, I mean, static analysis is not a massively good market, which is what I did my PhD in. But this one is like so much closer. It's like actual programming language tools and
yeah. And then what are the kind of atoms that you're building this platform around? Like, are you able to leverage things like Lambda or Azure Functions?
Yeah.
Or whatever?
So I mean, we're building it on Kubernetes.
Okay.
And it's running on GKE and Postgres in Google Cloud, and there's queues.
I guess it's kind of interesting then. So I generally don't like to date these things, but it was, reInvent was just recent, which is the annual, Amazon rolls out 100 new things. And even now, especially, it's like you see Google and Microsoft responding with their announcements based on what's come out. We mentioned layers earlier. Anything else jump out at you this year in particular?
I mean, just yet again, they have launched many more things. And that sounds good, right? People have launched new services, new products that you can use.
Yeah, shipping sounds good, right?
Yeah, but like it's just more complexity. The suite of tools in AWS that you need to make cloud software has increased yet again. And it will increase at next year's reInvent and the following year's reInvent. And do they do a 6-month thing in between?
I think there's, especially these days, I think there's so much that things come. Well, they do the small, I forget the name of them per city.
Right.
They have a circuit of cities that go through and do the cloud days.
So yeah, every 6 months or so, there's another 12 to 15 services that now you need to learn in order to be able to leverage AWS to build your startup, and that sounds like hell.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking with a previous guest who focuses on cloud and Amazon in particular, and I asked him the same thing, and I'll ask you. I've always found fascinating that we're like going on 10 to 15 years into AWS, and which has kind of changed the whole industry for the better. And I think a lot of people would look at the way they're organized as there's two pizza teams, but as these like very, very independent units that can prove a service.
Right.
And the barrier, I think, to getting the service out into production is I think some people would find shockingly low for a company that large.
Yeah.
But then the question I always come back to, I do wonder if at some point like it starts to kind of collapse under its own weight, because at some level there's no like directive for these things to play together in a sensible way.
Right.
Or there just be any kind of rhyme or reason other than now I think they're tiering. I think this is something new where they're actually creating they're trying to help you by saying, oh, here's the fundamental tier of AWS services, and here's your like AR, VR tier. You probably care about these things. You're over there. I guess
that's a good idea.
Some cataloging, right?
Right.
It does feel like it's dramatically more intimidating to sit down, create an AWS account, and get things going.
Right. So we built on Google Cloud. And one of the reasons for it is that it really seems a lot more polished, and the tools that everything works together, and it works together pretty well.
Yeah, it seems like when those things come out, there's one thing you can say for Google is it seems always very intentional, right, about how those things play together.
Yeah.
And I was actually going to ask what you thought of the other players, and or how important do you think this is?
Google is either third or fourth in the cloud market, but I think it's by far the best product. And the downside of Google is they have less services, but paradoxically, less services is actually better. I don't want to be every new technology of any kind that I add to my app is more complexity that I need to reason about, more things that can go down, is more risk, basically.
There's a cognitive overhead.
Yeah,
right?
So less tools that are better thought out and that cost less is a much better situation to be building on.
Yeah, maybe there's some answer there, but the other question I always like to ask entrepreneurs, especially those building infrastructure of some kind, and especially those, because the one thing I always talk to entrepreneurs about, and in terms of the $1 million question, right? Like, how do you compete with Amazon? Which I know, especially now, more in the venture industry, more and more people. That's like literally on their standard sheet. How are you going to compete when Amazon announces this is one of their 25 services next year? And I always tell people, think very, very carefully if you're going to compete with Amazon on compute.
Yeah.
And that's something you're charging headlong into. So how do you think specifically about how an entrepreneur should think about competing with not just Amazon, but any of the cloud providers rolling out a version of what they do?
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the Amazon has been working on for several years on a thing that is like what we do. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I know that they're working on it. And the solution that I tend to find is that things that Amazon invents end up being very good. Things that Amazon copies ends up not being very good at all.
Right.
So I would advise companies who are building a new thing to not worry about Amazon copying them. If you're building an open source situation that Amazon can just host, that's something entirely different.
Right.
But if you're building a new SaaS, yes, Amazon will compete. And it's when, not if, will they compete. If that SaaS is in the dev tool space.
And that win is when you've become successful enough that they think the market is there.
Yeah, and they'll take a junior PM and they'll have them clone your thing, and they'll probably make more money off that than you do. But it's not going to materially impact your service.
Yeah, I usually talk to people, and there was a period of time, I think, when they first started these, like, hey, every year we're going to roll out our 10 favorite services cloned, where I think maybe for about 18 to 24 months there was some real fear. But I think, if you've been paying attention, I always call it the 80-20 rule, where though I say usually they launch a 20% solution.
Right, yes.
Which honestly is, if you've got 5 million customers or whatever, the attach rate you need to generate meaningful revenue is really, really low.
Yeah, and a lot of people who need a service, they only need a small amount of it. They don't need all the bells and whistles. They just need, the thing that puts data into a queue and takes it out the other end, as an example. And a 20% service solves that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting from a competitive perspective. On the one hand, you have to push further than you used to have to, like 10 years ago, right? what you'd have to do, my product competed with CloudWatch. I'm sure they have some terrible copy of what Circle does. And probably what we were doing in the early days, that we were able to get traction with would be much harder now. So you have to build better product. But I think it's interesting is it also raises the barrier to entry for competitors.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you're able to get past that, especially if you're the one driving the market, I think is, as long as you keep moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at what companies are going to be successful in competing with Amazon, I very much look at it as, are these putting up a product that Amazon cannot do for some reason? So
Or will not do.
Or will not do, yeah. So, I mean, Replicated is a very good example of this. So Replicated is building an on-prem installation of your SaaS thing. And it's like, that's just not Amazon's world at all. It's doing some on-prem for people who really want to be in the cloud but want to have an Amazon-looking thing on-prem. And then with Dark, what we're doing is we're subsuming the entire thing. We're making it so that you don't have this massive complexity. And what Amazon thrives on is adding more services into the pile, more services into that complexity. And so they're not like building a holistic product that solves the need for AWS is not a thing that sits in their strategic vision.
Yeah, or I mean, I think even is fundamentally in their DNA, at least from what I've seen to date. I mean, what it would take to be required to get all these services to work together.
Yeah.
Which to their, in their defense, like all of these services have their own individual drivers and numbers they're trying to hit.
Of course,
yeah, whereas you have the quote unquote luxury of being able to focus on this one problem.
Right. The other thing that goes with that is that it does drive up the cost of what it takes to be able to innovate. So we're building this product, but we've been at it a year and a bit now. We raised $3.5 million to be able to do it. And being able to raise the money to do that pre-product is not a thing that is common, but is a thing that may have to be common to be able to compete in this space.
Yeah, I do think in terms of downsides, that's an interesting observation, because as impressed as people are with the large cloud providers' ability to innovate and roll out new things, I do think on a more somber note, like they'll never innovate and disrupt at the scale that millions of individual entrepreneurs will. And the fact that the kind of ability of those people to innovate and get a foothold, because it's never, again, if you look at every successful company, what they sold in their first year is a shadow of what they end up ultimately building. Yeah. And when that ability to kind of survive on that initial product is made dramatically harder because some, Levanthian is standing in your way, I think that does at some level slow down overall progress. So.
Well, the other way to deal with that is to build less and to build smaller things, smaller companies. And there's a little bit of a movement towards bootstrap startups and even investors investing in bootstrap startups, if you look at like Indie VC. So if you build something that is only ever going to make 10 million a year, Amazon isn't interested in that. And if they can't, if it's something super niche, but like there is an audience of people that you can get to that Amazon isn't going to, you can build a super protectable product there, and the moat is your lack of potential.
Right, yes. As long as you're going after an addressable market with a cost structure that market can support.
Absolutely, yeah.
No, I think understanding your market and how big it is, and then how you should build your company to attack it and what it means is such a critical thing that a lot of, especially first-time entrepreneurs, don't look at too hard.
I spend a lot of time thinking about business models. It's like a hobby, and when I was looking at what to do next after Circle, one of the options was obviously Dark, and one of the options was like build a nice small SaaS. And the goal of the nice small SaaS was that it wasn't going to be competed against by some VC-backed company or a Leviathan or something like that. And you can get very good very quickly at judging, is an idea something that is going to be VC investable or is going to be Amazon investable? And if not, that might be your nice, 1 to 10 person business.
Yeah. So one thing, and I'd probably finish up, but you did mention earlier, so I want to pull on that thread a little bit. In this discussion, the open source licenses, and something that's becoming increasingly more contentious, I think, is this notion that these cloud providers will cherry pick the most popular open source, and I think actually specifically the most popular stateful open source projects.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And actually offer managed hosted black box versions of them.
Yeah.
And whereas historically those companies, and if you look at, just some examples, there's Elasticsearch and Elastic, there's Redis, more recently Kafka, just last week was announced, and then Confluent, the company behind that offering a managed service. A Heavybit company, it's slightly different. We have Citus, who offers a hosted PostgreSDB, which is actually kind of a very interesting in-between, different than Aurora and RDS, so stands where it is.
It has its own special sauce for sharding and scaling.
Exactly, yeah, which kind of exceeds the native capabilities. So that's actually one example of like, how do you navigate that? But what are your thoughts on, because you're seeing things where people literally for the first time in 20 years are trying to invent new open source licenses to circumvent this.
So I think there's a general thread in our times about the tragedy of the commons of open source, that so many people are interested in it that everyone else can exploit it. And I'm actually not sure that there's a solution. And the reason being that so many people are making open source because it provides such value to them, and the value isn't necessarily monetary, but it's in some cases it's a sense of pride, in some cases it makes it much easier to get jobs, in some cases it's just a thing you want to do with your life. But under that world, we're just going to keep scaling up the amount of open source there is out there. And all of these challenges are not going to stop that from happening. So the question is, at the other end, can it be protected or prevented? Because no one's going to stop. And the things, was it the common mark that that's
Redis I think was
Redis Labs came up with it?
Exactly.
And they were working with FOSSA, which is
And I think Mongo was potentially looking into that as well.
We're concerned about the same thing. Like, if we open source what we do, which we're probably not going to do for other business reasons, notably that no one wants to install Kubernetes as the first step of their
right. We've established.
If we're trying to make something that's like really easy to set up, so step one, Kubernetes, no. But no one wants Amazon to run the service or the product that they spent a decade building. So I think people are going to make licenses, and half the open source world is going to hate it, and it's just going to continue to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this play out, I guess, about 10 years ago with AGPL, right, which was focused at this kind of an initial threat of people taking open source and then using it to build SaaS platforms that they were monetizing.
And there's similarly like GPL3 and...
Right, but then those all fell short of, or didn't address this notion of like, oh, well, we're not going to build a service out of it. We're just literally going to run it for you and manage it for you.
Yeah. At the moment, people are saying that those are not free licenses. So the new ones are not free licenses, the things that prevent you from running it as a cloud service. But I wonder if essentially an anti-mooching provision, essentially that's what the GPL was in the first place. It had an anti-mooching provision. And I wonder if an anti-mooching from cloud providers is going to be the next step that people accept as being okay.
Yeah, I honestly, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, especially because it's interesting in parallel to this. Your point about the amount of open source exploding. I think increasingly the path to delivering software, at least outside of niches, like not in like, real-time embedded OSs or whatever, I think there are still niches where proprietary software where you purchase it and you literally get some binaries that you can't look at the source for and you run them and trust them is shrinking. And I personally believe at least we're moving towards a place where there's going to be really two kinds of software. There's going to be managed software, whether it's like APIs like Stripe or things like Dark where you're hosting and managing all the bits, and the trade-off for complexity, I don't need to look at the bits because you're signing up to own them. Anything, and I remember building my company, we kind of quickly got to a point where like, if it's being installed on servers that I am responsible for, it's open source, like from the CPU up, the OS, the libraries, the applications, like it has to be open source if it's running in production because I'm not going to be dependent on you in the middle of the night.
Right, if you're running it yourself.
Yeah, and especially at scale, and we saw this, things, we were running the Cassandra database where we absolutely were, very, very few cases, but there were places where we would have to make changes to the core database itself to support the thing we were doing, and oftentimes those would make it upstream, but we weren't dependent on a vendor's roadmap to line up with our priorities, which they almost certainly wouldn't because we were doing something very kind of esoteric with it.
It's funny because we do the exact same thing, but Dark is sort of the opposite. And I think that's going to be true of any providers. The providers are, their value is that you don't have to or get to look under the hood. So if you're using Firebase or Stripe or whatever, things that you don't have to manage operationally, then those are the things that sort of get an exemption in my view.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, there's a whole half, which I think, it fit exactly that model.
Anything in AWS.
Yeah. I think you're certainly right. I think it'll try to be solved with licenses, and I'm kind of more hopeful that can happen there, because the alternative is just that there will be more bits held back in a proprietary fashion.
Yeah.
And you'll see more companies where there's a core useful open source thing to get over that hurdle, but then they will be holding more and more back because they'll need enough of a wedge against the large providers.
That the companies have traditionally held back have turned out not to be a big thing. So for example, the trademark stuff, open source companies have owned the trademark, and so someone else can't sell something which calls itself Firefox is the one that I'm thinking of.
Right. Yeah. Not to pick. It's just interesting. I just saw it because Amazon has some small on-prem thing as of last week, and so now you can literally quote unquote install Amazon RDS on-prem.
Right.
Which is MySQL or Postgres, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they have their proprietary bits, but it's come like full circle.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of High Leverage. If you'd like to suggest a guest or topic, let us know on Twitter @Heavybit. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out our library. It's an amazing resource for insights on developer sales, marketing, product, and general management from leaders in our community.